I'd rather take a study from Pakistan that has been looked into with the standard methods of like fraud detection. Fraud that happens in, the non sort of core Western countries, it's pretty blatant. Fraud that happens in the Western countries, dude, these people know what the fuck they're doing.
Yeah.
They are taking every, 0.1% advantage they can grab. They will take it. And they have like 150 of those, right? So they pack them all up. And then the study comes out looking a weird way. And you're like, what happened? Everything looks fine. They're like, I found this. And they're like, yeah, but that's just 0.1%. Right? It's tiny.
Yeah.
Like, that's probably not it. And then you're like, but I found this one. It's like, yeah, well, that's 0.2%. It's like, yeah, but if you add them all together and there's like, dozens of them,
Yeah.
like it's the same thing, but it's much, much harder to prove that something went wrong.
It's like the gerrymandering process within science. Welcome to Proof of Work with Jeffrey Kibler and special guest Alexandros Marinos. Yeah, we're recording, so we're just gonna start this off right now and get into it, man. So Alex, thanks for joining me here. Very first podcast ever. And the thing I wanted to start off asking you about is how we met, which was better skeptics. I feel like Jocelyn, my wife Jocelyn, who does Lady Scientist podcast, and you sort of met through this interaction of better skeptics. And I was hoping you could take the audience through what that was, what the initial goal was, what did you end up getting out of it? Tell us about better skeptics.
All right, so. Yeah, that was kind of awesome because especially how Mother Jocelyn was characteristic of the kind of thing I want, like, good Twitter, right? Where you just put something out there and you kind of see what comes back to you, and you kind of like recycle that energy, and hopefully if you do it right, the energy recycle is good and not bad, or at least you keep the bad energy like to manageable levels or something like that. So what was happening then is that, like, I was kind of like aware of things, and I was, this was like summer 2021, right? So we had about a year, 14, 15 months of pandemic, drama, 18 months maybe even going on, right? I had been sort of watching Brett Weinstein's podcast quite a bit, but that was about the time when he had started getting controversial, right? Until like a few months back, he was kind of just like, lab leak, whatever, which was okay, like controversial, but not like controversial. You know what I mean? Like, everybody was kind of like, okay, maybe, like, so long as you weren't like pushing back against public health advice for what you should do right now, people, I think, were mostly willing to let it fly. But the moment it becomes, about what should we do looking forward, I think that's when it, shit started really hitting the fan. So, that was kind of happening in the background, right? So as a viewer, I was just trying to figure out what I thought about this whole thing. And
what was Brett kind of what was the controversial thing that Brett was like getting some heat for?
Right. So what Brett had released at that time was basically like a set of podcasts where he just kind of opened up his whole hypothesis. And I don't know that he ever like sat down and laid it out, but basically he had originally had like Yuri Dagin, who talked about lab leak, right? That was like a while back. And then as it was getting closer to this time, he had the kind of the epic one with Malone and Kirsch, that is Robert Malone and Steve Kirsch, which was like painful to listen to, but in retrospect quite predictive, I would say. He had the one with Pierre Corey, and then he went with Pierre Corey to Rogan, so that's another two there. He had Gert Vanderbosch, who talked about variants and viral evolution. And at that point, everybody was like, there's not going to be any variants. And if there is, our vaccines are going to just like hold it all back. It's going to be fine, whatever, like completely, now this sounds idiotic. At the time, but like the virologists knew. So clearly whatever they were saying was like management, but the public didn't know what to think, right? So, and so, through those, I don't remember if there was like any other podcast that was sort of in this vein, but basically he kind of laid out, if you kind of took it all together, he laid out a hypothesis that something is going terribly wrong with the public health response to the pandemic, right? Like that something isn't quite making sense, and that there are significant scientific perspectives that are not being taken into account. And especially with Malone, being, the claimed inventor of the mRNA vaccines, that's kind of important, right? Especially at that moment. So I had like watched all of that, and I was kind of thinking about it. I had also just gotten vaxxed like recently, right? So it wasn't like anything Brett says goes, but I was like, okay, he might, um, he might have a point. So as although that was happening, I just witnessed an ever-growing negativity towards Brett and Heather, and not necessarily because of something I could identify, right? Like I was like, okay, what specifically is it? Just tell me, And people were just like, oh, well, there's just pseudoscience, like whatever, you couldn't, like, I was like, yeah, pin it down, please show me. Like, and one guy actually went and said, look at this podcast in this moment, Kirsch said this. So I went, and he didn't. Right? I was like, gee, this is quite something now. Like I'm literally chasing a ghost. So that was kind of when I got this idea for that Better Skeptics project that you asked me about, which is that he's I kind of saw like this whole sort of a lot of argument and fighting on social media, nothing new per se, but it just bugged me that I couldn't get to the bottom of like what were people fighting about, right? Like what was the actual issue here that we were trying to negotiate. So I came up with this structure that basically said, look, I'll pay, I'll put down my own money to put some prizes so people aren't like, oh, you're trying to make us do research for nothing. And what I asked people to do is to come up with a set of claims, right, that would go through a first sort of filtering by referees for, does this look reasonable on its own without any external research, just like as a claim, is it like consistent? And then that the ones that kind of pass the first phase will get put out again for counterpoint, right? So the people who obviously did not agree with those claims could say, hey, no, that's not true because XYZ, right? And then those would go through a second round of filtering to see if the counterclaim sort of defeats the claim, or the claim still stands because the counterclaims are not, strong enough, let's say, right? So that's where I needed referees, and sort of Jocelyn volunteered there, and that was great because obviously with her background, which I believe is a PhD in molecular biology, that kind of helps. If you if you start like having good answers to like 98 of 100 challenges, you start to get the idea that you have a good answer to every challenge. So you always have to be a little bit careful, because you never know when you're going to find somebody who actually knows what they're talking about and is not actually coming after you, right? And I'm not saying like I do that well all the time. I definitely struggle with that. Sometimes, you just like fob somebody off that said something that wasn't as obvious as it sounded or whatever.
Sure.
And I'm sure, but I that's what I try to do. I try to see people who come at problems with nuance, and then I kind of turn off the fence, right? And I sort of try to engage a little bit more. But it's a hard game. I think long story short is that like the way I play Twitter, I'm very, very happy because I can put in questions. I think that's when it shows the power of what that platform can do. My followers are such now that I can put in like hard questions about complicated things, and I can get very interesting answers, right? Like where I was like, did I ask the other day, like about viral shedding, right? Which I didn't think was a thing, but somebody was asking me, a friend was asking me, and I was like, hey, let's put a question out, see what comes back. Then I got back like several studies on like deep stuff, and I was like, holy smoke.
Yeah.
I might have to dig into this now, because it's so much stuff that is actually a lot more legit, at least on first blush, right? I don't know, than it looked when like I hadn't asked the question, I guess. So that I think is kind of how the platform works. And if I stop being able to do that, I think I'll probably have taken a wrong turn somewhere.
Gotcha. Yeah. Now, just for the audience, what is RCT and why? And what does it
Right.
mean to be the golden standard? Because this is one of the things we were talking about yesterday on Twitter, where I was just, I actually had to ask Jocelyn. I was like, "Hey, help me understand this a little bit," and she kind of explained to me, and then it was like this light bulb, like, "Oh, okay." But if you could dive into that one a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, of course. So basically the question is like, how do I know a drug works, right?
Yeah.
It's a basic question, but like honestly, it's a lot harder than it sounds. So the way they used to do it back in the day is maybe they would just give a bunch of people, right, a drug and like kind of see what happens or whatever. Or you go by reputation, right? Like it's like, well, I gave it to my cousin and my cousin, whatever, Okay, so at some point, they had a lot of contradictory findings, right? And we're like, all right, what is really going on? So I don't know when this started happening, randomization as a thing, probably like early 20th century. I don't know if it goes further back from there, but that became a paradigm that became ever more refined until we got to what is called a randomized clinical trial, or maybe is it randomized control trial, maybe something like
I
that.
think it's control trial.
But basically, the idea is that you take two groups of people, right, and you randomly allocate them to groups.
Yeah.
Canonically, a placebo group and a treatment group. You can do more complicated things, but that's kind of your basic setup. And the idea is that let's say that your drug works better in tall people than short people, whatever. You might not even know what that pattern is, but because you've randomized people, you're kind of bound to get some level of balance between like tall people and short people in both groups. So that's not unless you've called it out, that's not going to be what shows the one group to be a lot more sort of affected than the other or something like that. So basically it handles confounders, both the ones that you know and ones that you don't know. So that's why that's the story, at least around why RCTs are sort of the gold standard in medicine.
Yeah.
The problem with RCTs, however, is that they have great internal validity, as they call it, right? Like within the walls of the randomized trial, like what you learn is going to be, unless you botch it, which you totally could, but like for the exact thing you test and the exact thing you try and the exact point in time, population, a bunch of things that are like intrinsic to the time and place you do your experiment and the various criteria you used, what you learn is going to be very likely to be true, right?
Yeah.
However, the problem that RCTs have is what they call external validity, right? Which is like, okay, well, you went to, let's say, Brazil, right? And you did a trial on ivermectin, and you found a result. Is that result going to be true for the rest of the world for all time? Right. Well, it turns out that Brazil at that time was undergoing, a huge spike of the gamma variant, which actually doesn't exist anywhere else. And also, because of that spike, everybody was taking ivermectin on the side. So now, right, like sales have gone through the roof like 20 times over. And you could get it, by the way, in a pharmacy, right? Here in the US or like other countries, you have to get a prescription. It's kind of hard to get. But there, because they have the parasite problem that it was approved for. It's a very common drug. It's got low side effects, so you're going to get people just going to the pharmacy, right? So you try to do a trial. Now put yourself in the mind of a patient. You got COVID, right? And it's beating you up pretty badly. You're also a high risk patient, which is what that trial was optimizing for, right? You got COVID, you're a high risk patient. They approach you. You're like, do you want to come to our trial and take ivermectin? You're like, what, the thing I can get at the pharmacy? And they're like, yeah, and if you come to our trial, there's like a 50% chance we might give you ivermectin or we might not give you ivermectin. I mean, it only takes half a brain to say like, sure, yeah, give me the special, nice treatment. But, on my way back, I'm just going to go by the pharmacy and get some, right? So, you see this pattern actually in another trial in Argentina. The guy literally said, the very fact that we were talking about doing a trial was pushing people to go to the pharmacy and buy ivermectin. And you can even see it on Google Trends.
Wow. Like, I never thought of that one. Like, you're actually, by talking about the trial itself, you're inducing the people in the trial to break the protocol of the trial. Right. Because they want what the hypothetical solution is.
Another trial in Colombia actually lied to people by saying, we're going to give you this drug called D11AX22, which is actually the molecular description of ivermectin. But then if they were taking ivermectin, they wouldn't know to like not take it. Maybe they told you, hey, don't take ivermectin while you're taking this drug. But you're like, it's a different drug, whatever, right? Like there's no real easy way out of these kinds of problems. So you might, again, for the population you've tried it, at the time you've tried it, right, you might get something that is true, but like, what does that mean? How do I apply that learning to the real world is a whole other question. And that's where I think people overextend themselves with randomized trials, because the other thing you can do is an observational trial, right? Like, so for instance, again, with ivermectin, just because this is the thing I've looked into the most, they did this trial in Mexico where anybody basically who got a positive test in Mexico City for a period of a few months, they would just give you a kit, right? And the kit had, I think, aspirin, ivermectin, I don't remember what else, but like mostly ivermectin, a bunch of a few other things, but like kind of the big one was ivermectin. And they wrote that trial up, and it looked really good. And then people were like, well, but we don't know who chose to take the drug and who chose not to, and did you follow the patients and whatever? No, but it was like, I don't remember now, like 80,000 people, right? Like that's a lot. Like you start to resolve the external validity problem, because you cover like a whole area for a period of time, lots and lots of people. But they're like, yeah, but like internal validity is a problem. Sure. But anyway, so that's, clinical trials are a mess basically, and we don't really know anything.
That is really so. All right, I'm going to bring this in a slightly different direction, because Jocelyn asked me to make sure I asked you about this one. Tell me about Dr. Roller Gator and describe your man crush on him.
My man crush. I do not have a man crush.
Those were my words, not hers.
So what do you want to? So Gator is a fascinating. Remember like what we were talking about, like Twitter and managing the interaction. I think like Gator is a teacher in terms of like not having people who have tried to go after him end up humiliated, right? Like they really kind of more often than not sort of regret the interaction, because he and I think the way he does it, I mean, I'm sure it's like he does a lot of things on many levels that I couldn't possibly explain, but one of the things he does is he comes across as quite like frivolous or whatever. He types in all caps, whatever, right? So they're like, oh, this must be some 14-year-old child. And then, they come after him with something like, well, you didn't think about that. But it turns out he's like a fucking amazing mathematician statistician. So then he'll come back at you and you're like, whoa. So, he does, he exposes people, I think, a lot for their conceit by ridicule, but also sort of on point, right? Mm-hmm. Defensible ridicule. So, I mean, right now his account is suspended. So, rest in peace for the moment until the resurrection by our Lord and Savior, Elon Musk. But for the moment, things are pretty tight for that account. But yeah, I think Gator really is a source of many lessons in sort of managing narratives without being fake. Yeah, even though he's obviously fake.
I mean, he's an entertaining account, right? Like he's not just sitting there giving you facts and figures, even though that's included, but he's putting on a show too.
Yeah, I think like it's an aesthetic, right? Like what he does and what other people do, I think, is not, as you say, right? It's not just like dry, but it's an aesthetic. It's these are the things that I couldn't quite describe to you, but you kind of get a vibe for the person. So some people just can't stand him, right? And it's not that I'm like, you're wrong, or it's just, you either like it either resonates or it doesn't. But like, yeah, I don't know. I definitely enjoy his stuff when he's around.
So, a slightly different direction again, even professionally, how you run your own company, something I don't know too much about it at all, but it's an Internet of Things company, Balena. How do you find time to do all this, amateur? I don't want to call it amateur because it's really like impressive research. It's not my this is not your profession that you're doing like on this stuff.
I'd be lying if I said that it hasn't taken time that would have gone elsewhere. I think this is kind of important, probably also for Balena to figure out what the hell is going on, for me to like get my bearings, and like, because ultimately, if you think about it, right, like what's happened in the world in the last couple of years, and you know what, I'll rephrase that. What's happened in my world, right? Because I'm sure lots of people kind of like had a much more sophisticated model. I was pretty much a normie, right? And diving into these things.
Yeah.
And gradually you get a sense that like lots and lots of things are not as they seem, right? So that actually affected my ability to run my company, because as an entrepreneur, you're supposed to predict the future, right? Like you're supposed to kind of know where to go. So really, in a way, what I'm sort of doing with all this stuff is I'm trying to find a way to get my bearings back so I can do my job. Because if I don't know, like, I mean, people want to be like, yeah, hey, Internet of Things and like medical stuff, like, what does that have to do with each other? It's like, dude, have you seen supply chains recently? Do you think who that affects, right? And supply chains have a lot to do with how the political sort of management of the whole pandemic has been going, and I need to know if I can trust these people or not, right? Like a lot of these questions are intertwined, and so I happen to come across one question that I've gotten, very educated about. But like a lot of the things, it's the things you learn about one, small question, you can actually expand very, very easily once you hit the ground. So in a way, I think what I'm doing is actually a service to myself and my team, just trying to get my bearings. At the same time, I do think, like, I gotta this stuff has to take the back seat at some point, and I gotta get back into full blown focus.
Is your background as a software developer?
Yeah, I mean, computing, I don't think I've worked like many years as a working software engineer, but like computing is my background, like my PhD and stuff. And then I started this company off of that.
And what does the company do?
So what the company does is, if you have an Internet of Things device, right? Like okay, Alex, what's that? Like a thermostat or a drone or a self-driving car, something that is a computer but doesn't look like a computer, basically, right?
Yeah.
It's not a laptop, it's not a mobile phone, but it is a thing that has a full-blown computer on it. It's connected to the internet. Those things also need updates and sort of management and stuff like that, but you don't have a user, right, to say like, hey, there's the new update here, do you want to install it or whatever? Or if it breaks, like, they'll take it to service, right? They're kind of just like, think of them like the Mars rover or something. Like, that's how I tell my team to think about it. You got the Mars rover, and it's like on Mars, right? And nobody's going to come to help, right? So you got to approach how you write software and how you, all the services you built around that fleet of devices, in a way that is like extremely like careful about like the reliability of the thing. Even if you give up a little bit of performance, even if you give up a little bit of like space or whatever, like the number one thing is like reliability, right? Like, we can't lose, we can't brick stuff in the field, because it might be built into bricks in the wall, right, somewhere. Like, you really have to be careful. So basically what we do is we build the plumbing for people who have that kind of fleets of devices.
I see.
And so we are kind of like AWS, if you know, from like cloud computing. Like, we're kind of in the background, and we power people with fleets who do all sorts of things, right? From like blockchain sort of mining stuff to as I said, drones or cameras or thermostats or screens or whatever. But as again, like, this is how this all comes back, is like, as I've understood sort of how power functions and how networks function and how control functions, I've started to become a lot. I started to do a lot of thinking, basically, around what do we want to be as a company? Do we want to like just kind of sit back and enable like a massive surveillance sort of apparatus to?
I'm glad you
emerge?
said it, because that's exactly ding 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 in my mind was going off. I was like, I wonder how many undercover NSA agents are working in there.
So the thing is, like, one thing that you realize when you're working with this stuff is that security, you do your best, right? You really do your best, because honestly, like, somebody attacking us is going to be a real problem, right? But at the same time, if you are an honest software engineer, you know that what we know is very little. Like, things are like 0-day exploits, this and that. Like, there's so many fingers and so many pies and so much going around there. And really just think about it from a formal perspective, right? Like you've got a software system that's made of like just the Linux kernel is, I don't know, 10 million lines of code or whatever. Like what are the odds that like there's not a bug somewhere that's just gonna, you know, zero. That's the number. The number is zero. There's zero odds that whatever. So as I've been sort of, thinking through all of this stuff, I think my perspective has also shifted towards, right now, if I think about like good and evil in the world, if let's just like blow it all up, sure, whatever. I think about systems of control versus systems of enablement, right? Things that try to make people succumb to like zero sum logic of like, well, there's only so much, energy in the world. There's only so much food. There's only so much space. There's only so much whatever. So people start coming at each other, right? Like they're like, well, I got mine, or I'm gonna get yours, or whatever, right?
I mean, there's a good. We had the last rabbit hole we did. One of the things that we talked about is that good and evil almost always has a point of view, and that we are. One of the things that I think of, because I know you're a kind of a first principles sort of guy, is in terms of first principles when thinking about ethics. And this is a reasonably new development in my way of thinking, is that the memes must support the genes. And what I mean by that is the ideas that you have, your consciousness, and what comes from your consciousness has to support the longevity of the genes that you have. And this is actually, I know this is something that like Stephen Patterson and one of the Weinsteins was reflecting on in that YouTube you recommended the other day, that podcast, the Dark Horse podcast. They danced around that, but that's 100% what those guys were talking about. And that you have to have some sort of competition, and it will and it can be competition between two individually ethical systems, from the point of view of their own survivals independently, right? So anyway, go. You were saying,
but this is kind of getting where I'm going, which is that like in a zero sum world, right? Even good people are forced to do things that they are not maybe proud of because you're starving, right? Like you're running out of whatever, and that's your family starving, right? That's,
so 100%. You can't slight those people.
Sharp elbows and everything. But in my mind, like these are all self-reinforcing dynamics, right? Like if we believe we're in a zero-sum world, we act like we're in a zero-sum world, and we make it real. Or what's the alternative? The alternative is like to be in a positive sum world, right? To actually enable each other to go out in the universe and like in the world of ideas and whatever, and pluck out concepts that are sort of generative, that open up new dimensions for all of us, right? So if we support each other, then we can maybe find new dimensions of goods, either material or immaterial. Like people could be like, well, but there's only so much gold in the earth, right? So we gotta like compete. It's like, well, there's asteroids out there, and they're probably made of gold, like much more than you think. And there's people like into like asteroid mining or whatever, but that's the difference in sort of dynamics, right? Like if we cooperate, we can actually all together sort of work to open up completely new fields, whereas if we go at each other, we end up destroying even what we have, right? So zero-sum games don't stay zero-sum, they become negative sum, whereas positive sum games actually become infinite sum because we keep building and building. So
if you survive, if you're part of that, if you're part of the surviving segment, right? And I kind of think of what you're saying as like, let's take like there's this trope that capitalism is like this terrible destructive force, right? And like billionaires shouldn't exist in this and that. I actually feel like billionaires are often the people who have optimized the cooperation and versus competition continuity most successfully, right? They knew who they've cooperated with the most people. Like they are getting the most systems of people working with them to a unified goal, while also destroying their competitors. in many
Well,
ways.
here's the thing, right? Like people will talk about somebody like Bezos, for instance, and they're like, oh,
Yeah.
he takes advantage of employees in his warehouses, and for all I know, they could be right about that. Like, I'm
Yep.
not saying that like he's a saint.
Again, point of view, right? Like some of those warehouse employees probably love it, and some of them probably feel exploited. It's
Sure. But the thing is, like, there is a single mom somewhere in, I don't know, like West Virginia, that like can have a one-click button to get diapers at home, right? And that has to count for something, right?
That's the cooperation. Everybody wants what he's offering, and it didn't exist before.
Right. So and by the way, like, the moral calculus there is absurd, because you got like millions and millions of people involved on both sides of that, right? So that's where you're like, okay, well, the market will decide, but then you got people interfering with legislation to put their thumbs on the scale, and then again, it gets complicated. But I guess my I want to make sure I complete the original question that got us down this rabbit hole. So my view on Balena is that, like, surveillance, sort of centralized control kind of world, is the negative sum or zero sum, which becomes negative sum, which becomes about, like, I got mine and I got to take yours, or whatever it is, right? And my thinking is like, yes, it could be like that. And honestly, if it wasn't Balena in this world, it would be somebody else who probably would have a lot less objection to making it like that. But my question to my team often is like, how can we make it not that, right? How can we make it a positive something? How can we make the machines to be an amplifier of the human, right? So like Iron Man, for instance, right? Like, where it's a machine, right? It can fly, it can do things that humans can't do, but inside there's a human, like, that is, and the movements correspond one-to-one with the human, right? So it's like taking what is there and like making it 10x 100x rather than making it 0.5x, like control, fit in a smaller box so we can feed you less, or whatever it is that you can do. So really, the tech, I think, can be used in multiple ways. And where my thinking is very, very often is like, how do we bring it to more people? How do we lower the barrier? How do we make this like a symmetric weapon that everybody can use, and that can give benefits to everybody? And also, how can we reduce the centralization of it? Like, these days, I'm thinking, like, how can I make it not have centralized servers, right? So if it was infiltrated by NSA, which I sure hope it isn't right now, but I don't know the heart of every single employee of Balena, weirdly enough. But how can I make it so that even if we were infiltrated, they wouldn't be able to get anything, because there isn't anything there, right? It's some sort of distributed, open, like, trustless kind of system that ultimately is sort of reviewable by anybody. These are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. Like, how do we take this technology that definitely has potential to be used for evil, and make it something that either is, a worst neutral, but hopefully better than that, right? Something that enables humanity rather than controls it.
Yeah, for sure. And how do you guys think about, there's kind of two scenarios in which I've heard, you could have sort of terrorist-like attacks coming from Internet of Things. And I don't know jack shit about Internet of Things, really, but these are two things that I've become tangentially aware of. And one is simply using those devices as sort of like the worst DDoS attack ever, right? Because you just have so many computers, and if you can deploy something and just get them pinging the same thing at the same time, that's a nightmare. And the second thing is just like being able to do sort of like, shut down everybody's fridges, just wreak havoc on thermostats and things like that. Like, how do you guys think about security measures in that way?
Look, ultimately, what we do is make updates very easy, right? And that by itself, like, forget everything else, that by itself is a type of security mechanism, because if you can't update your thing, it will definitely be vulnerable, right? If you can't update it, it might be vulnerable, but if you can't update it, it will be vulnerable. So you're already, like, there's like tons and tons of Chinese made stuff that's like, you can buy it for like $10, right? And it's this amazing little widget. You can put it at your home, you can connect to the internet, whatever, and it can do like incredible things for you. What you don't know is that it's probably running like a version of Linux from 15 years ago, and it's always going to be running a version of Linux from 15 years ago. And even if it's not, if it doesn't come with spyware, right, out of the box, it's going to have some sooner or later, right? So, making it so that it can be managed using principles that, cloud computing has figured out, over the last few decades, getting those ideas to the devices space. That's kind of like what the company was made to do to begin with, right? They just give some baseline of functionality where, it's not abandonware, right? It's not this thing where you can just like ping IP addresses and just like grab whatever. So we do a lot to sort of, close down attack loopholes, pathways, and then also be very conservative. We do virtualization. Anyway, there's like a lot of technology we use to make it a lot harder, at least, right? You can we say like we're going to keep the NSA out of your boxes?
They've got a lot of resources.
That's a hard sell. But can we keep like script kiddies out of your boxes? Yeah, we can do that, and probably a lot better than that. So
that is such a humble answer, by the way, right? Like that is, it's like, yes, if we have state actors targeting us, this might be a problem to, deal with. But if, you're run of the mill jerks, it's script kiddies, as you said. Yeah.
I mean, look, the thing is like, we rely on like the kind of encryption that banks rely on, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the question is that good enough? Like,
right.
I don't know. I don't want to freak anybody out. I'm just saying we're the best you can get, and it's only good to a point, right? Like once you get to like determined opponents, state level actors or whatever, things get, it's better to consider that you're like probably not protected and act accordingly than to just sort of outsource your protection to like, oh, the Linux kernel is protecting me, or like GitHub is protecting me. It's like, I personally would not bet that is happening, even though I don't know. I'm like, this is not me like sort of signaling something I know. I don't know anything. For all I know, we're perfectly secure and everybody's perfectly secure. But what I'm saying is like the priors are just not great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm utterly convinced that all of the major tech companies and social platforms all are both formally cooperating with those entities and have informal people inserted. Like I can't see how it's otherwise, right? Like
I guess for me the real question is like, how do we design things such that is not a problem, right?
Right.
That's really the question, because you can't to think that you're always going to be a step ahead is just foolishness. I think the question is, how do we get out of the rat race? You see what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that was always fun talking about intelligence actors.
If you're listening,
yeah, guys, we're not that bad. We're not the bad guys. Okay.
Yeah, look over there.
Yeah. What other topics would you get into if you had more time? What other things would you rabbit hole?
Oh man, so I've got this thing, and I part of me wants to say I'll never get into it, and part of me wants to say like I'll find a way. So I don't know if I'll ever get into it, but I want to get into the whole like energy story, right? Like about renewable energy and fossil fuels and that stuff, because, and the reason I think I can actually sort of bring something interesting to the space is that I guess people might know this, but like I started getting active on Twitter because I was digging into Tesla. Actually, it wasn't about sort of the virus. It was more about Musk and Tesla and that world. So I have a decent sense. I wouldn't say like I'm an expert or anything like, but I got a decent sense about like renewable energy and the various curves of batteries and solar panels and all that stuff. And what I'm noticing is something that is actually, interestingly enough, I think it's a failure mode across many industries, which is that people use sort of Malthusian linear curves, right, to just judge everything, right? And when it comes to energy, by the way, I see that on both sides, which is amazing. So you got the renewable energy people being like, you're running out the oil, blah, 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 we're going to run out of it. It's like, yeah, but when the price goes up, it can go deeper in the earth and can find more oil. Like, innovation.
They only project 30 years out anyway, because that's all they bother to explore for.
On the one side. On the other side, they're like, oh, you're going to fill, we're never going to be, there's not enough cobalt in the earth. There's not enough lithium. There's not enough whatever. It's like, but there's other technologies like Tesla. People don't know this, right? They're like, oh, Tesla is using cobalt, which is being dug out of the Congo from little children. Yeah. And it's like, well, actually, they're buying from Canada, but there's a counter argument there, which is that, yeah, but it's fungible, right? So if Tesla goes and buys the Canadian cobalt, somebody else is going to have to go and buy the Congolese cobalt. And in Congo, there's definitely some supplies that are terrible. So Tesla is actually it's doing a lot of research to reduce the amount of cobalt it needs. And in fact, half the cars it's making today don't use any cobalt, but people don't know that. So I think a lot of these questions have like these sort of non-linearities baked in, because basically when there's a limit, people tend to find their way around. And I think fascinatingly for me, both sides in this question are operating as if linear curves will continue forever, and they're debating like which linear curves do we pay attention to. And my thing is like, forget your linear curves. Like, that's not how it's going to play out, right? We got to find something more stable to build from. So I'd love to dig into that whole like sustainable energy question, but I don't. As you might imagine, it's the kind of rabbit hole that you can go into and never come out.
And do you think battery technology itself is the right way to be approaching dramatics improvements to those the space that you're talking about?
I think so. Like, look, again, what people don't know is batteries are improving about 7% a year, right? And
Okay.
that's going to reach some limit, but 7% is not a little.
That's good.
And a lot of time, so for instance, right, there's this one car that's coming out that's not a Tesla, weirdly enough. It's called Aptera, which is like, it looks like a I don't know how to call it, like the perfect aerodynamic shape, right? Like it's just been designed with like no concern for looks or anything. It's just the perfect aerodynamic thing, and it's got solar panels on it, and it can do like 1,000 miles because not because its battery is just so big, but because it's like it just glides through the air basically. And then they put the solar panels on there, and they're like, look, you can get 40 miles a day just out of solar panels, right? Why? Well, because they've optimized the batteries, they've optimized the solar panels, they've optimized the whole thing, and it breaks through a boundary, right? Because 40 miles is as much as people drive per day, right? Most people for most days,
Yeah.
or less. So once you break through that boundary, then you're like, it's not about like, do I have a charging spot, right? It's like you can just leave it wherever, so long as the sun hits it enough, and you're in the right sort of geographic boundary. And a lot of people are. Some people aren't, but a lot of people are.
Yeah.
You start to have like some weird effects like that, right? And again, these things are getting better and better. Solar panels are getting better. Materials are getting cheaper. Batteries are getting more storage. So, and a lot of these things are operating with market dynamics, right? Like, so the more demand there is, the better, cheaper, and more sort of efficient they get. And a lot of it is about crossing thresholds, right? Can I have a solar panel on my thing that will gather enough energy for me to fill my needs for a day, in a day, right? So I'm optimistic that like we're overestimating, I think, some things. Other things are just not going to work that way. But it's probably not going to be as easy as some people think, but it's probably not going to be as hard as others think. Just weird centrist take, but there you have it.
What I know so little about energy and all of that. It's very difficult for me to even comment rationally on what's possible or not. But with that said, California has had some interesting stuff come out in the past few days or the past few weeks, I should say, where I don't know if it's like by 2030, 2035, they're not going to sell gas powered cars in the state anymore.
California can go get bent. Honestly, they're killing us, right? So there's this documentary that everybody should go and watch called "Who Killed the Electric Car," right? And it is an incredible thing to watch, because basically this has happened before, right? Like, this is history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And in this case, what happened in like 2000, I don't know, like 8, I think, or maybe a bit earlier, GM put out an electric car. Do you know this? The first electric car you could buy or lease was a GM called the EV1. And people loved it. I mean, it couldn't go very far, but it was the first EV you could get, and it had like regenerative braking and a lot of things we know now from EVs and stuff. So people really loved it. And what happened was California was like, aha, you can make electric cars, and they started pushing regulations. So what did GM do? They nixed the project entirely. They literally repossessed all the cars. They put them in a pound. People were holding vigils outside that place to like prevent their cars from being taken away. ultimately they did take them away, and they literally just crushed them and threw them away in the desert. Like,
why?
because GM was like, shit, we've let the cat out of the bag that we can make electric vehicles, and now they're going to start passing laws, and they're going to kill our gas business.
Oh my God.
Right. I mean, I'm saying it a little bit more simplified than it is in the thing, but like I put the blame squarely on these cafe standards that they're called, and because California basically drives the whole of the U.S. Right.
Oh
Whatever
yeah,
happens in California,
everything.
everybody else has to kind of
They got 1/5 of
they're the biggest market.
country's. Yeah, they're the 1/5 of the country's population, and they're the most liberal state, and they drive all of the regulation from there. Is
Yeah.
my understanding.
Yeah, so I think they're 1/5 of the economy as well. So like, you know,
Maybe it's the
like
economy. Yeah.
So that's the thing, right? They step in with the hammer. Part of me says, like, because politicians just want to get credit for something that's already going to happen. But in that case, back in 2008, they probably made it not happen, right? Because effectively they scared the car companies so much that they just put all the lobbyists and all of their, like, the deviousness to work. They literally repossessed the cars. I think there's one car out there that they didn't manage to repossess, and you can go see it. All the other ones have been destroyed. It's just so...
That's nuts.
Right. So like, this is what pisses me off. Like, this is a transition that's going to happen. Like, Musk, honestly, they try to destroy him. They try to kill a guy. But he still, like, pushed through. And now they're like, well, look how nice we are. We're bringing a sustainable economy. It's like, stay out. Just do something else. Find a hobby. I don't know what you're going to do. Just like leave it the fuck alone. Because what that is doing is creating a lot of counterforce that we don't have to deal with, because the cars are fucking amazing. Like, Tesla's got a year back sort of order right now, right? Or whatever it is. It goes up and down, but like it's really hard because the demand is through the roof. Because when oil is like where it is right now, you don't need to convince people to buy vehicles. Like, it just makes sense, right? So, you know, they've built this incredible business where, like, in good years it's a luxury good, so everybody wants it. In bad years, it's like a way to save money, so everybody wants it. And it's working perfectly. And the government is stepping in now and is like, we're going to force you to buy it. It's like, why? We can't make them fast enough. Nobody has them.
Yeah. Well, in addition to that, California is saying this is like in the last 2 days, don't charge your electric vehicles because we're having an energy shortage.
And again, the energy problems are because they've overregulated their power companies to like, they tell them how much they can charge, right? Which means that there's no money to be made, so they don't maintain their infrastructure. And then it's like, well, the infrastructure is collapsing, and the power company's like, what do you want me to do? Right? You fix it. Like, you forced me to, like, not make any money ever. So I'm just sitting here being, you know,
and by the way,
by proxy.
We're not going to clean up the dead trees around all the power generation.
We'd rather shut down power, because why not, right? What are you going to do? Like, we're not going to make any money, but we're a monopoly, so you kind of need us. And like, it becomes this, like, deranged situation where at least nationalize at that point so that we can point to you, right? What they're doing with regulations is they're forcing these people to never make any money, but also never improve their service. And somehow they're like, well, you know, the market capitalism is destroying us. It's like, no, actually, that's probably just you regulating stuff and just ruining it. So it's really, yeah. Regulation it's like coding, right? Like, but anybody can just put lines of code and nobody can stop them. So it's like worse somehow. There's no way to refactor. They just, like, keep stacking them up until something is bad enough that somebody's gonna be like, hey, we gotta fix this thing or whatever, and maybe gets fixed like 20 years later.
I mean, it is kind of hilarious that I feel like California got like it has become because it is so magnificent and beautiful and everybody wants to live there, so that they're willing, like, the value add of the environment of California is such that people will put up with such ridiculousness just to be there. So you have all of these psychotic bureaucrats who just have their way with people because they're like, you know, it's like 75 and a cool breeze every day. How can we get away from this?
I mean, Greece is the same, right? I grew up in Greece, and, like, honestly, just to go there is the most beautiful place in the world. but to live there.
One of my favorite, I heard this years ago. It's like the Greeks, they invented philosophy, art, and mathematics, and then they called it a day.
Yeah, I'm about to call cultural what is it, appropriation on if this thing keeps going. I'm getting ready.
I have never been to Greece, but I always wanted to go. It seems fantastic.
It's, like, look, I'm definitely biased, but like, because I grew up there, so I love the food, I love the place. It's nice to be able to speak, my native language.
Mm-hmm.
It's just I enjoy the hell out of it, but like then sometimes I'll like run into like the bureaucrats. Like I had to renew my passport recently, and I was like, dear Lord, I know why I don't live here. Like it was like I literally had to travel to like so I went to the police station near where I was my Airbnb, right? They're like, oh yeah, you can come back in 3 weeks. I'm like, I don't have 3 weeks. I'm gonna have to go back to the US.
Yeah.
So I had to drive to different city, right? I drive to different city. They're like, okay, yeah, we can help you out, but you need this piece of paper. Oh, go back, come back the next day. They're like, okay, yeah, you can come back next week and get your passport. So I come back next week. They're like, oh, we don't have it today. It's gonna be here tomorrow. And I'm like, people,
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
this is like 100 miles each way or whatever, like a couple of hour drive. Now like I've done like 4 times rather than like 2 or 1, because like I mean, God forbid to put it in the mail and give it to you or something, right? Like, and it's like, oh, this is painful. You know what I mean? Like, and they don't care. It's the same thing as California, basically. They're like, well, what are you gonna do?
What are you gonna do?
You're gonna not have a passport, right?
You're gonna not live in the most beautiful place on earth? What?
Yeah. So that's the story. It's trade-offs, right? Trade-offs all the way down.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember the stories of when Greece was joining the EU and like Goldman Sachs was like helping them out. And
definitely helping.
Helping.
That's what they're being altruistic.
Helping them out.
Goldman.
And it's like they basically like they cook the books on how much like nobody pays taxes.
Dude,
like
everybody knew.
Right.
Everybody knew what was going on. I'm sure of it. Right. But they were like, look, it's your funeral. You want to cook the books? Cook them. The bill is going to come due at some point, right? Like we're not going to make a fuss about this or whatever. But just know that at some point this thing is going to blow up and it's going to be blowing up in your hands, which it is.
Like all the Mediterranean since the Roman days have been skipping out on taxes, and they try to make it like we didn't understand this was going to happen. What do you mean Greece is not exactly on the up and up?
The thing is that basically structurally the way the euro has been built is that basically Germany has a lower currency because it gets averaged out with all the other countries, right? So they get to like export things on the cheap, and then they get all this surplus, and then they're like, oh well, we're not going to give you money unless you do this and this and this, and everybody else is like, but we're poor, like we're having to pay for everything in euros, right? So basically when Greece had drachma, right, back in the day, it was a common headline that the government is like undervaluing the currency, whatever it's called, like 14%, right? So everything just unilaterally was 14% cheaper, right? We get out of debt, we don't get the latest cars, but hey, like it's a manageable system. With a euro, nobody can do the same movement, right? So now they're like, well, we're gonna cut the salary from those guys and we're gonna add taxes here, like just trying to emulate the same thing, but you can't really do it unless you have a currency, right? So basically it puts the country in a very, very tough spot. And what's worse is that for like a good decade, people were loaning to Greece as if it was Germany. It was this weird thing where we had like German interest rates, right? And we were like, not me, like politicians.
Right.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do this.
And at some point, people were like, hey, we're not sure we can loan you guys money anymore because you might go bankrupt. And everybody was like, really?
Well, and right now, what I feel like is going on with the euro, I mean, the euro is essentially just like Europe is to the United States as Greece is to Germany, I feel like, where the US dollar is essentially the reserve currency of your European Union. And everybody's just trying to devalue their currency as fast as possible because they've got too much debt and prices are going through the roof, which leads prices going through the roof.
The way I think about it is that like the US at least has the Fed, right? Or whatever. And there's like one monetary policy.
Yeah.
In Europe, if you want to like devalue the euro, you got to go to the central bank. Central bank is this thing that it's got people elected in different countries that appoint different people and everybody's fighting. It's like California and Alabama are sharing a currency, right? Which is fair enough. That's what's happening in the US. But
yeah.
California is not that bitter about having to fund Alabama all the time because they're like, hey, the people who grew up in Alabama might be software engineers and they come to California, whatever. Like, it's okay, like broadly speaking. Right. In Europe, people don't think of it that way. They're like, this is German money that's making its way to Greece, and we're not going to give up on our pensioners for your pensioners. And it kind of makes sense. But again, like we've tied each other.
Yeah.
Like, we're all tied at the hip. Right. And nobody's getting out of this boat alive. and everybody's being petty about it. And but it is different governments. Right. It's not one government. It is different. So part of me thinks that the euro was set up this way in order to force a federation ultimately.
100%. That was the entire goal. Was the idea was a cultural assimilation across Europe to strengthen those ties so they wouldn't go to war again, and that we're also going to have the pricing power of a larger confederacy like the United States has. And yeah,
the thing is, like, it's right now it's been sort of put in the middle of like the hill, and it's like either going to tip one way and they're going to go like for super high integration, or it's going to tip the other way and it's all going to fall apart. And it's super unclear what's going to end up happening. But I can tell you that people in Greece used to be a lot more pro-Europe than they are today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all. I don't know too many Europeans, and I mean, I don't, so it's hard for me to say, but I get the sense from what I read that it's teetering quite a bit, you know, the especially with energy prices going with what they are, and you know, you literally have the politicians throwing up billboards in England saying that, you know, this is the price that we have to pay for freedom in Ukraine, and that, you know, we're gonna it's like, this is worth it.
This?
It's phenomenal, like how price of democracy. Thank you for grinning and bearing with us.
I'm not there, right? So you know, I go back sometimes and I'm like, you know, I haven't really been like mentally in Greece. I mean, I left 17 years ago, but like I was in Europe, I was in the UK for a good chunk of that time. But like for, I don't know, the last almost a decade now, I've not really kept up at all, right? So sometimes I go back and I'm the ignorant American, weirdly enough. So it's like honestly, when we were living in Europe, we used to sort of marvel at how much Americans didn't understand the world outside the US. And honestly, having moved to the US, we fully understand it because there's just so much shit happening in the US. You don't have time to like think about like, oh, what's happening in Asia? What's happening in Europe? What's happening in Greece? What's happening in Africa? I don't know. Like, well, stuff, right? But like, you know, did you see Biden yesterday?
You know, it's also, I feel like, and this kind of leads into another line of questioning that I want to have with you, that our education in the United States is so bent on this sort of like liberal utopia where everybody's can get along, as everybody's like the same, and like we all, you know, at the deep down have the same core values, and that people in the United States can't picture the idea that Europe was for hundreds, if not 1,000+ years, warring fiefdoms, you know, with very distinct cultures, with and not to say that Europeans like hate each other and like whatnot, but they shit on each other a lot. Like it's not like
California and Alabama, I'll tell you.
No, right? There's not this unified thing.
Like between California and Alabama, like there's like a lot of like teasing or whatever.
Sure.
Or, you know, making fun of each other's accents or whatever. Like it is very different if you've been at war with somebody for like 200 years, right?
Exactly.
Like people don't fully appreciate like what that means, and culturally, right? Like generations upon generations just slaughtering each other, even before the national state was born, by the way. So like, you know, Balkans, right? Like Greece is part of the Balkans. Like what is the expression, to balkanize, right? Like this thing, like, it was like this like big region right? And really, it wasn't just the Balkans. It was like Anatolia, like modern day Turkey, the Middle East. It was just like this mosaic of people. Like a village could have like 10% Jews and 20% Armenians and 5% Greeks and 60% Turks or whatever, right? And really, they didn't even think of themselves as Turks and Greeks. They thought of themselves as Christians and Muslims or whatever, right? Like it wasn't even that clear cut. And at some point, they just drew lines and like, we are the state of this country or the state of that country, and you get exchange of populations. So my grandparents from my mother's side were Greeks, we would say today. They were Orthodox Christians in modern day Turkey who were kicked out, but they spoke Turkish, right? Yeah. So then they come to Greece and everybody's like, you guys are Turks. They're like, no, like they specifically kicked us out of there because we're not, right? So, and then I met this guy playing, online sort of, I think Risk or something on Facebook back in the day. And he was like, yeah, and my grandmother was like deported to Turkey, even though she was speaking Greek until she was 101, right? Because she was Muslim. So it's just like, the degree of interconnectedness of all the people in these areas. And, when we learn history in Greece, like we learn history, right? It goes to 4000 BC. And we learn all of the reasons to be angry at everybody throughout time, right? And I'm sure everybody else is the same. So it's not like U.S. history where it's like, 1786 or whatever it is, that 1787.
Yeah, there was the Egyptians, and then there were the Greeks, and then there were the Romans, and then there was the American revolutions.
Greeks and Iranians still hate each other for stuff that happened like 2,500 years ago. Like,
yeah, Americans have no. I mean, I didn't have any sense of that. At least until my 20s, and it was like when I just started reading independently, and like it was like, holy shit. You meet people from other countries, and like, well, you guys aren't exactly the same as we don't all have these independent values.
And by the way, that's the thing, right? You hate each other, but then like you'll meet each other, like I don't know, being students in the UK, right? And you realize that you're like very similar to each other and very different from the Brits. Right, or whatever. So you gotta have beers, have fun, or what. So again, it's just very, very multidimensional, and it always happens that way. But if you're not in it, it's very, very easy to mistake that for, I saw this thing, I just could not get over it, and like it's petty, right? So people are gonna be like, really, that's the thing that pisses you off, but somehow, this thing that was going around, which is like, oh, white people have plain food. Right, or whatever.
Yes.
And I was like, no, we don't. I was like, oh wait, am I not? Like it just gets really complicated really quickly. Just asking a simple question like, is do white people have bland food? I don't know if they're Brits, maybe. Right.
Well, but it's like back in the day, like people who were from the Mediterranean area were considered white. Like, no, Italians weren't considered white.
There was this law actually passed in Australia that was like, with very careful selection, perhaps we can let in some Greeks.
Yeah, it is funny how the window of like how people think of who, like Jews are white now. Jews were never white, 50, 100 years ago. They were Jews, right? Like and even now I'm seeing on some social media, it's like that Asians are now effectively white people. How does that work? I don't.
Well, it just tells you something, right? That the label is functioning differently than what it sounds like.
Than what I grew up with, right? For sure.
Yeah, and it's sad a little bit. Like you're forced to think about people like in terms of. This is gonna sound really weird, but like I had this friend of mine in the UK, right? Who's like his dad was from Nigeria, right? So presentationally he's black, but like he grew up with his mom, like who was like I don't know, like Irish or something. So like I just didn't think about it, right? We just hung out, and then I was like, hey, Jim is black. Like not that I didn't know what he looked like, obviously, but like I just hadn't classified it that way, and then like it just becomes a thing, right? And then you start thinking about stuff, and you're like, ugh. But like, I just don't register him that way because culturally, he's not different than like any other person I
had the same experience. I mean, I grew up in New Hampshire, so almost everybody was white. There was like one black kid, and then there was a Mexican girl whose family owned like the Mexican restaurant in our grade school and high school. Like that was the racial diversity in southern New Hampshire. And then I went to college, and it was sort of weird because like the black kids, like we were trying to rush this black kid into my fraternity, and like it was like, oh, you can't really do that because your friends will ostracize you, because there's sort of this barrier. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Never, and then obviously as I got older, I was like, oh, okay, there's a whole bunch of conflict through these things that I wasn't aware of whatsoever. But yeah, it is very strange how those things sort of manifest themselves. And like I feel like these days it's gotten as odd as I can imagine. Like I just can't.
What I find fascinating is that, again, just to go back to ivermectin, just because that's the topic I've been digging into, is how research from different countries is perceived as being less than or better than, because like, well, this study was done in Nigeria, or this study was done in Brazil, or this study was done in Mexico, or whatever. And people won't come out and say it, that they think it's fraudulent just because it was done in a, what did Trump call it? Yeah, that country. But like, you kind of get the vibe, and they'll tell you in hushed tones in private that like, well, if it's not really from like a top grade Western country like UK, US, that's basically it. But what we're willing to consider is like Anglosphere, really, maybe Australia, maybe if they're really nice.
Well, and then we come to find out that all the top-notch stuff is largely captured by very sophisticated players.
So here's what I found out, right, which really ties it all together. Fraud is everywhere, right? Just like dishonesty is everywhere, but there's not all is lost. What I found, what my sense is right now, is that I'd rather take a study from Pakistan that has been looked into with the standard methods of like fraud detection that we have, because fraud that happens in the non sort of core Western countries is pretty blatant. Like you can just sort of tell. Fraud that happens in the Western countries, dude, these people know what the fuck they're doing.
They are professional.
Sophisticated. They're not fucking around. Like seriously, kind of stuff. I mean, if people have read my stuff on Together, I'm like, they are taking every 0.1% advantage they can grab. They will take it, and they have like 150 of those, right? So they pack them all up, and then the study comes out looking a weird way, and you're like, what happened? Everything looks fine. They're like, I found this, and they're like, yeah, but that's just 0.1%, right? It's tiny. Like that's probably not it. And then you're like, but I found this one. It's like, yeah, well, that's 0.2%. It's like, yeah, but if you add them all together, and there's like dozens of them, like it's the same thing, but it's much, much harder to prove that something went wrong.
It's like the gerrymandering process within science.
Fantastic way to put it. I call it Potemkin arguments, right? Like Potemkin villages that the Soviet sort of had, that sort of these days, like let's say you see a dignitary going to North Korea, right? And they show them like this beautiful village with like everybody's like orderly and everything is clean and whatever. And the story is that like when they leave, like everything collapses or whatever, or it's like the houses aren't real, they're cardboard or whatever, right? It's kind of like that, where if you look at it like twice, you're like, wow, this looks great. And then you lift up a little rock and you're like, hey, wait, this is plastic, right? And you look up, it's a Truman Show, right? There's a camera, like it falls down and you're like, where did that come from?
Yes, 100%. So okay, go on.
No, it just gets so I'd much rather trust, I'm telling you, like a straight up, straightforward, very simple study done in Dhaka, Pakistan, or Dhaka, Bangladesh. Right, that was just done by somebody who just wanted to do a clean study, and did a clean study, and it's very straightforward. You just look at it and there's nothing to be confused about, right? And then you look at these like complicated platform adaptive trials with like multiple arms running at the same time, and you're like, yes, like these people are a lot more competent, but they're playing with machine guns, right? They're not, there's just not water guns anymore.
It's very, very sophisticated. It also reminds me, I at some point when I was looking into like the lab leak stuff, there was like the chief science guy of China, and he apparently like he's like Zai's like #1 science dude, and somebody was brought to everybody's attention that he had committed fraud in a number of his papers. And the way in which he had committed fraud was simply taking like pictures and inverting them, and you like varying them by just changing their rotation and
Right.
and making them the inverse, and like it was like what so such a he just knew that it didn't matter, and he just had to do a plausibly good enough job of making it look by somebody who is just scanning to not get caught,
Right.
that the fix is in, whatever, let's go.
Right. It's just like, yeah, that's like minimum viable fraud or whatever, right?
Minimum viable fraud, yes.
You see a lot of that. That's the thing. Like if you see a bad study
Yeah.
abroad, I just feel like it's just like pretty obvious that it was a horrible study.
So I was, my professional world, this is years ago. I was, judging some SQL queries that were being written as a test for some of our partners over in India, and they just, some people suspected fraud, and they brought me in to like just, say like, did I suspect it? And like, it was so blatantly obvious that they had just copied each other. They kept even like the same indenting, the same, like there was like one parameter that they would change, like variable names, but like all the other stuff would be like exactly the same. I'm like, how, this is not possible. Like you didn't write these things yourselves. So, but it's like, what I came to understand is that for some segments of the population in India, it's like passing was more important than anything. Like you didn't, it didn't really matter if you were copying off of somebody, but you need to give the appearance of competency. Otherwise, it's a huge risk for you and your family, and you don't, pass through school and this or that. So there was a little re-education that went on expectations that had to go on. But this is kind of how they grew up.
Here's the thing. So I had a very, very similar thing in the UK when I was a teaching assistant, right?
Yeah.
So I was sort of evaluating homework for students, right? And people don't realize this when they're turning in their homework, but when you're looking at a group of people and you're like, all the Cypriots had the same variations of the same assignment, right?
Yeah.
And all like, not, I don't know if all, but like 95% of the
enough
each national cluster, like it was identical or close, or like they changed the colors or whatever, the background.
Yeah.
You're like, dude, this is so blatant, like whatever. And you could even tell kind of who did it, because they probably did a little bit more on theirs, and the other ones like weren't confident when they were demoing it or whatever. Like it was blatant, right? Here's the thing though. They did what they did. The university was like, I was like with my professor, like, what are you going to do about this? And he's like, well, I can't like fail 80% of my class.
Yeah.
Right. So they passed. So who's the fraudster here, right?
Oh no, it's a fraud up and down the chain. And this is like, I mean, I don't want to like get on my high horse about the United States, because I think we have unbelievable problems in the academic system these days, especially outside the hard sciences, where it's like none of a huge swath of the humanities, the James Lindsay, for example, submitting these papers, to these journals that are just completely and utterly made up, that get in there and like highlighted and whatnot. So it's like, it is becoming ubiquitous that
but that's the thing. It's not just the hard sciences. That's the thing. I mean, what I've seen in medical sciences is just, so many things. I think about it sometimes like the internet, right? The early internet was built on trust, right? You could send an email to anybody and pretend to be anybody, and they would receive it, right? And it would say like, Bill G at Microsoft.com sent you this thing, right? Because they hadn't thought that like, it's, and they've had to remake basically all the protocols, HTTP became HTTPS and whatever, like just to encrypt like all the things, so that like it's like the barest security. Well, when it comes to science, we're still back in the day where we built everything to run on the honor code or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's, it's just become this raw power game now, because everybody knows that the rules are not solid enough. So everybody knows it's judgment that has to be applied. So it's actually the worst of all worlds, right? Because the FDA makes things hard enough so that only big pharma can really get through the process.
Yep.
But it is also like broken enough that they can get anything they want through the process. So it is just, I can't go and get a drug approved, right? Because it just needs so many hoop jumping, but the hoops are pointless, right? Like they're just hoops. So if you know what to do, you can get, almost anything through. And, that's just how it is. It's just how, like it's really the worst of all worlds in some parts of the health space. And I guess this is what really has gotten me to pay so much attention to this, because it's just dire. Like, you don't really know what to trust at this point. And it's not like, okay, you bought a toy that like didn't last as long. Like, these are drugs that are killing people.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I have become, I used to be, I remember conversations not 7-8 years ago that I had where, I would do my little condescending thing where I would say to people, who believed in, I can't even think of a good example.
Compliance with the science.
Yeah, I was just like, if it worked, they'd call it science. And I was, I'd say shit like that. And now I'm like, oh God, that's so cringe.
There are some people out there who still play that game.
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. And now I'm like, if you get on that horse, like, I think you're a fraudster immediately.
Yeah, you got to be like, the thing is, like, ultimately we're trying to pass enough regulations that like we'll get the fraudsters or whatever, but we're not realizing that there's a higher order system, which is incentives, right?
Yeah.
So if the incentives are aligned so that people are want to get through whatever rules of the game you set, they're going to want to go through, right?
Yeah.
So you can find all the flaws today and make a perfect rule system that's going to catch all of them, and turn your back, come back in 5 years. They're going to have a whole new set of tricks, right?
100%.
They pay a lot of very smart people to find exactly what the problem is with your regulations.
Absolutely. Like, and I think there's no way in which you can design a foolproof system where you have a benevolent authority with sufficient power at a scale the large enough of the United States that you can end up trusting independently. I just don't think that that's a reasonable thing to think can occur. Is that a statement that resonates with you?
Yeah, I think honestly, people are trying to like get incentives out of the system, basically, just like legislate them out or whatever. Like, oh, we've got conflict of interest regulations. It's like, yeah, but who does anything other than for interest? Like, so what you're just adding hoops. But like, question is, can we use incentives, right? Can we put skin in the game? Can we have things that you are held liable? Like, for instance, right? Let's talk about something slightly controversial, like Facebook shutting down the Hunter Biden story. What if we said you can shut down whatever you want? Yeah. If it turns out that it was real, you're now on the hook for like billions of dollars. Yeah. Do whatever you want. You're clear to censor, but skin in the game. If you turn out to be wrong, you're in real trouble. Right? Yeah. Like, but they're not, I'm not saying that like what I just described doesn't have flaws, but what I'm saying is like that kind of thing where people are sort of have freedom to act in the moment, but also are liable. Right now, we're like, well, I passed, I did it by the book, so I'm not liable, even if I was wrong, right? Yeah. So everybody's just like investing more and more money in lobbyists or whatever, so that there's enough loopholes that they can do whatever they want, basically, without oversight.
Let me take this conversation as I'm going to build off of, I think, the direction that we were going there, but I wanted to touch upon, like, you and I are both, you have an infant right now, or a few month old. I've got a 1 5 weeks, 6 weeks now old. And you, upstairs with mom.
Are you sleeping?
Am I sleeping? Once a week or so, there's a night where it's difficult, but overall, it hasn't been that bad. It really, mom does a fantastic job. And you have a 2-year-old now? Is that correct?
My eldest is 3. 3.5. Yeah, 3.5, and the youngest one was like, I don't know, 9 months now. So It's the problem is the eldest. I'll tell you that much. When you have a second one, the problem is not the first one. You kind of know what to do. It's managing the it's managing the other one.
Yeah, I have heard this before. I've got a couple of years before I have to start figuring that out. So we're both fathers of young children, and we both have a highly skeptical point of view towards the authorities that are producing what is popular consent and knowledge out there. And obviously, these ways of thinking that are producing these people are coming from our education system. How do you think about that in terms of your having your own kids go to school, or however you educate them, in order to produce people who can effectively operate within society, but also have an appropriate skepticism and ability to like come to good conclusions and make good choices?
Look, I'm not, um, you know, I might not be able to pull it off, but I was, in principle, at least I was pro homeschooling before this whole mess happened, right?
Yeah.
Now, with what I'm seeing, it's like, if at all I can, I'm going to do it. And I can probably afford it. And honestly, I just feel bad for people who can't,
Yeah.
right? Because they're
Yeah.
just going to have to take the default and like it. And the default is getting worse and worse really quickly. I
Yeah.
mean, and again, I don't know if it's my perception of it or if it really is getting worse, and I think it's a little bit of both. But Jesus Christ, I mean, it's a scary thought to know that, like, yeah, you're gonna like basically outsourcing in all of its forms seems to me today to be a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Right, that you're gonna get somebody and you're gonna throw some money that way, and it's whatever's gonna come back, it's gonna be as if you did it, and it's not, right? So this idea that parents can like outsource education to the state, or that the US can outsource making, oh, I don't know, surgical masks to China,
Yeah.
right, or whatever. Like, it all works until it doesn't, right? And when it
Yeah.
doesn't, you're screwed. So I really think we've got something supply chain wise really kind of wrong in Western civilization that we haven't really thought it through.
Yeah, I for sure. I mean, one of the trends that I noticed, so and I think Shaky is one of the people that has really opened my eyes to some of this. Is like how you send kids off to these schools and they get educated um, in a way that makes them radicals. Like they makes them like think that the people who came before them were ignorant. And I'll tell you from my own personal experience with my parents, kind of had that attitude about their parents, right? There was like something that was sort of, and my parents were the boomer generation, and they were, and they, a common theme would be that, well, and this is mostly from my mother, who's dead, God bless her heart, but she would like to, comment about how, the older generation was, ignorant and didn't really know what they were talking about. And I kind of like looking back at it, that seems to be like a cycle that continues where if you how can it be that everybody was so ignorant yet we got here and so fine?
It's an arrogance, right? It's a type of arrogance
Yeah.
that we all like live in. And as you say, right, we got this far. It's not a small thing. And I think we somehow have adopted this view that like whatever was discovered in the last 30 years is the best thing ever. And whatever
Yeah.
came before is the worst thing ever, or something. And it's like, if you say it like that, it sounds idiotic, right? So it clearly
Right.
couldn't have been, but somehow we operate as if it were, right?
Exactly.
And yeah, I think honestly, right now I'm just going back to like, what is the tried and true? What is the proven? What is Lindy or whatever it is, like,
Yeah.
what has lasted for like a good couple of 100 years? Like, I'll trust that over some newfangled thing that came out of a lab yesterday, and they're like, everybody's got to take it today, and you're like, maybe tomorrow. you know,
Exactly. Maybe
I'm not
tomorrow.
like skeptical of everything always, but like, give it a couple of days, right? Give it a month. Like, maybe don't take it like the first day, like whatever. It's like you just think about all of everything, and you're like, we just tend to think that like, this meme that's going around, right? Like in Roman times, the average age was like like the average lifespan was 35 years old. Yes, because like infants died, lots
Right.
and lots of them, right? It's not
But
like
if
like people would like grow up to be 35 and drop dead,
right.
right? They still live till they were 80. Some
Well,
people,
what they leave out in that average calculation is if you made it to year 4, you
yeah,
probably made it to year 60 plus.
right, or you died in a war, but
Or
like
or yes, or yeah.
one of the two, really. It wasn't quite that you like lived such a hard life that you would drop dead at like 36 with like white hair, like wrinkles or something. Like, yeah, but we just have this impression of the past that everything was terrible. And it's like, I don't know, man. I think like there were pockets of time when things were horrific, and there were pockets
Yeah.
of time where things were pretty great. And yeah, we just flatten it all out and we just put it in a bucket and just kind of throw it away. And I don't think we realize how precarious a situation our civilization is in right now with these global supply chains and the whole
Oh
thing,
yeah.
right? There's like Rube Goldberg machine like around the globe, basically.
Yeah, the optimism, like that's another thing that has really in the past 5 to 10 years of my way of thinking has evolved quite a bit. And this is comes from Taleb and whatnot. You mentioned the Lindy is that and shout out to Paul Pertesi who really
Oh
drills
yeah,
this into everybody on Twitter all the time. Um, is that optimization begets fragilization. Like everything that you optimize to and the more that you optimize it will increasingly fragilize something else in the system that you may or may not be aware of.
yeah,
And it's the unaware of part is I think what you're getting at when you talk about that Rube Goldberg machine, and what people don't seem to understand about these supply chains and how fragile they are, and how simply a country like Ukraine, which produces 30 between Ukraine and
right,
Russia, that
right,
produces 30% of all the wheat and the fertilizer being taken offline for
right.
say 8 months. What the
Yeah, or
hell's going to happen?
somebody somewhere just having their hand on a tap that you didn't think they were ever going to turn, but it turns out that politics trumps money, and therefore you're screwed, even though you thought that money would trump politics, and it doesn't work that way. And now you're scrambling to make, I don't know, chips or whatever in like Oregon, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, holy shit, like build factories. It's like,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to like scramble and be like exposed, caught with your ass in the air, right? Like missing like fundamental things to support a civilization. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, I was just listening to a Jocko podcast about that because he's doing a lot to bring American manufacturing back. I mean, he's doing it with a couple of clothing products and then some protein shakes and whatnot. But one of the things he talks about is that we took this entire the greatest generation built this entire manufacturing base, off the ruins of Europe because they didn't everything was gone over there. But it was, and then once we had captured the market, we sold off that production capacity to the lowest bidder. And
Yeah. I mean, one startup I've sort of helped startup, not like my startup, but just help them, is doing, sort of super, like, you see my 3D printer there in the back. They do like they want to build like sort of mini sort of factories with like 3D printing style technologies that are like super agile, so they can build
yeah,
whatever they need whenever they need it. Like not consumer stuff, right? Like more
yeah,
high grade. But like I really think that that's kind of the future, is like adding flexibility to our supply chains, because honestly, if you have a factory that makes, I don't know, like paper clips, it's always going to be making paper clips,
yeah.
right? And the thing is that like the world is a lot more fast moving now than it was. One pandemic here, one pandemic there, right? Things go out the window. And I think what we kind of need is a flexible manufacturing capacity that is near the markets, but not inflexible manufacturing capacity that's far from the markets.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, what is there? Do you think there is a potential for an American manufacturing revitalization in the next decade or two?
Yeah, that kind of thing that I just described. Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I think, I mean, the US is very, very lucky, right? Like it's the best defended place on earth or whatever, like with a lot of land from coast to coast. A lot of very capable people. And some of them in this generation are not that capable. They're gonna have to become capable because, hey, what are you gonna do? So I think there's a lot of all the right ingredients, right? So that people are gonna do what they're gonna do. They're gonna have to do. But I guess what I'm personally worried about is AI, right, and how that intersects with everything else, because that's the kind of thing that has the capability of like upsetting everything, so I tend to avoid thinking like more than like 10 years out, because I just kind of, it's always in the back of my mind that like, unless either we figure out that it's not going to work, right, so we kind of like lay back a little bit, or we figure out that it is going to work, in which case there's really no point thinking past, I don't know, 2030, 2035, because it's just going to be, what they call the singularity is not necessarily that's like, Skynet is going to show up. It's more like that we don't know what's beyond that point, and I think that's kind of the thing. So I have a really, really hard time thinking like what world my kids are going to grow up in, mostly because I just know that there's a few of these factors that we went through that have the potential of like changing the world so dramatically that, no matter what I think about right now, it's just not going to be not going to be that relevant unless it's like super generic, right? Like thinking in terms of like epistemological frameworks rather than like which stock should I own, right? that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any. I don't think any futurist or anybody does 10 plus years out at all to any degree of accuracy. I mean, if you can do you can predict 5 if you create it yourself, right? Like if you can do 5 if like you have a vision that you're kind of agile to, but and get somewhere. But beyond that, I think people are just a lot of mental masturbation.
It's just like there's like the linear models and where things are pointing at that you can probably like stretch out and kind of get a sense of like what a prosaic future looks like. But like every day you add to the tail like of those models, like there's just these other like factors that have some small chance every day, but like with enough days that chance becomes like one, right? That they will blow up and they will change everything.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
how do you deal, like I honestly don't know, like how you deal with that is a big issue. And I have
this is a problem I
gather
have with
cash and like food in your basement, and that might not even help you out. Like I don't know, buy a gun.
Yeah. I mean, this is my problem with like the climate change models and people. It's like, like one volcano can go off and it will produce more CO2 than we've made in all of our history.
Yeah, models aren't science. People have to understand
Exactly.
this. Models are not science. Just FYI, people. Like,
if anybody can leave here with anything today,
yes,
models
please.
models are
PSA.
cute.
What does Sam Harris say? Like, let's do some home cleaning or whatever he says it.
Yeah.
Some housekeeping. Models are a thing that the dude made in Excel. Okay. It doesn't mean anything. It all garbage in, garbage out. Like, let's see the predictions that come out of these models come true, and then we might have something that's kind of sort of like science. But until that point, please, put them in a different pile than your science, because like, look for things that are, like food. They're like, eat things with few ingredients. That's also true of like your epistemic frameworks. Just believe things that have like a couple of assumptions, like not like 50,000 assumptions. Like that's like processed food. Like just don't, just leave that for somebody else. But like, so that's why I kind of like what Brett Weinstein talks about with climate change. Is like, look, there's methane under the ice, and we don't know how much there is.
Yeah.
But we know that if it starts coming out, it's going to trigger like a recursive effect, and that's really bad. So that's probably not something we want to do. But like, he's not like, look at the model from that science school of whatever. That's like got like 50,000 steps in Monte Carlo simulations or whatever. Like, sure, you can, but like there's this other model, and like, yeah, I've been yeah, my world has changed a lot in the last several years.
Yeah, mine too. I mean, I used to be one of these people who thought these things were eminently predictable, and I thought we had a grasp on things. And then, like, I was like, oh, wait a minute, everybody's lying all the time.
I'll tell you something that people have found funny. Like the most optimistic thought I've had recently is to think of multiple ways the world could be destroyed, so that they could possibly interfere with each other, and maybe we have a future.
I like George Carlin's quote: "The world is going to be fine. It's us that's going away."
Yep. That's a good quote to end on.
Yeah, I was feeling that, maybe we'll end it right there. Seems like the positive note for this conference. The models are bullshit. The world's going to be fine. It's us that's screwed.
Yeah, man, that guy. He would have a lot of fun if he was around.
Oh my gosh. If we could get him back, it would be absolutely brilliant. But Alex, thank you so much for joining me on my first podcast ever.
Good to be here.
This is a real pleasure. I appreciate your time and your insight, and we'll have to do it again at some point.
Let's see who are you gonna get shaky? Who else are you?
I'm definitely gonna get. On my list is Shaky. I've got a friend of mine, Ed Clay, who's kind of this businessman, jiu-jitsu guy, who's on the list. I'll share my list of asks. Actually, awesome. One person you can help me get. I want Stephen Patterson. I really like that guy's mind and how he thinks. I think he is yeah, I have some admiration for him.
I really enjoy his stuff. Anyway, so I look forward.
Cool. All right. I will catch you later, Alex. Thank you so much.
Bye.